now that we've seen how the ideals of classical liberalism were expressed in, say, Locke, and seen how those same bits of language can be twisted to totalitarianism in Rousseau, let's actually take a step back and look at the 7 fatal flaws that remain in classical liberalism. So, I'm going to talk about 7 different types of actions that an organization can do that will distinguish it as a coercive organization as opposed to a voluntary one. For each action, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is. I'm going to talk about a voluntary analog, if there is any, right? Things that a voluntary organization that could or would do that would be like this, but not quite the same. I'm going to try to home in on that difference for each one of these actions and show why it's different in a principled way rather than just a degree way, right? And then I'm going to look at the way that the incentives of that action move it in over time, basically. This thing for example, this thing creates an incentive structure that causes services to get worse and worse over time, and here's why. So, and then after that, what I'll do is I'll go back to the voluntary example and list some alternatives of ways that you could kind of get away from the coercive elements of this particular type of action. Then I'll note that one of these types in particular I think is more dangerous than the others because it is a strong enabling force for them that turns them from something that could be seen as voluntary to something that definitely isn't. So, without further ado, let's get into part 1, which is going to be taxation. All right, taxation. Now, this is kind of the big one, right? It's ragged on the most. The phrase taxation is theft gets shouted a lot, and it probably gets shouted a lot more than conscription is slavery, even though they're both true. When libertarians or anarchists or voluntarists yell something, it's usually something like taxation is theft. Now, But of course, there's a lot of people who don't see it that way because they've been, indoctrinated into believing that the state is doing things, for their own purposes or some kind of social contract nonsense or whatever. But what is a tax at its base? It is a fee that is taken from an individual for services that the government, whatever this organization that we call the government, deems as its function. So it might be police protection, fire protection, the use of courts, the roads, something like that, right? If you get into a really bad government, then it's healthcare and, food and shoes and stuff like that. Now, the thing about a tax that is different from like a voluntary subscription fee is that the services provided by the tax, ostensibly, might have very dubious value, right? Or they might be provided very shoddily, right? The government might say, yeah, you can't hire private security, you have to use our security, but our security sucks. Or it could be that, you have to pay us for fire protection, but we only really make it to 1 out of 3 fires before they reach the end of their fireness, right? Now, in the case of, voluntary organizations, we'll call them companies, right? Generally speaking, the good companies will provide a definite service, and they will often actually reimburse the user for failed service times if the fee is just a fee for like a service. So like, for instance, I think my internet was out for a couple of days several months ago, and I got a $5 credit that month for not having internet for those couple of days. A lot of companies don't bother to do this, and a lot of companies arrange things so that you're paying for a distinct drip of something, like your water company charges you per gallon, and so you're not out anything because you don't have water for 5 days. You just don't use that water, which is kind of a shaky argument. But generally speaking, if you were dealing with private arbitration, you could say, hey, you didn't give me any services at all this month. I want my money back. I paid you for this service. I want restitution. And there would be a lot of arbitration organizations that would be in favor of that. Would say, yeah, you agreed to provide X. You didn't provide X. You're in breach of contract. Well, what are the penalties for being in breach of contract? Stuff like that. Now, the difference is that when you are a taxing organization, a state, right, you don't need to actually provide any service to claim the money, right? Oh yeah, I didn't go find the stuff that was stolen, even though you had video of the guy who took it and a good nice face and fingerprints and footprints and all that stuff. We just didn't bother to go get your stuff back. Well, what am I paying you for then, right? Well, it doesn't matter what you're paying us for. You have to pay us anyway. That's the kind of the thing of taxation that separates it from voluntary subscription fees. And in fact, because governments can do this, and I'll use the word state here, because states can do this with their taxation, they also have an incentive to provide less good, less timely, less effective service over time. There's no competition. There's an ability to take funds from non-payers, even if you don't provide them any of the services that you promise. There are all kinds of alternatives to taxation, right? You could privatize existing tax-funded organizations. It might, be annoying because because fewer people are going to want to pay for this crappy police station organization because they don't actually solve any crimes, and they'd be much more willing to pay a reputable security company. But this could be done. It could be that all of these organizations that are currently working off of tax funding either privatize themselves to provide a service with an actual contract and for a specified fee. You could have different fee structures for different levels of service. You could have subscriptions. You could have crowdfunding. And you could always just have, legitimate contracts that are administered and judged by a third party and not one of the parties of the contract, that provides specified services with particular terms that make the contract enforceable, things like that. So taxation is the big one. It's taking money from you, not necessarily even money, right? Because that gets us too much into a question of, what's the money? It's taking wealth from you without your consent to provide services that you either don't want or that they don't actually provide. And that you have to pay for regardless of whether those services are provided. And so that's taxation. That's kind of the big one, but there's not really that much confusion about it, right? Anybody who says that taxation is legitimate is someone who believes that there's some kind of social contract, which is implied consent. That's rape crap. We don't need to worry about that. Or they say that, oh yeah, you're paying for a service. Well, the government doesn't provide the service, and it's incentivized not to provide the service because you can never, ever stop paying them, and they can charge you whatever they want. So, it's not, there aren't very, very many good arguments in favor of taxation. And it's something that gets done to death in libertarian media anyway, so I won't flog it anymore at this point. Let's move on to the next section, which would be Part 2, Conscription. Conscription is forced labor. It's slavery. It is usually done in modern times for military purposes, the draft. But it may be used for plain labor, like how Roosevelt said he was going to draft a bunch of steel workers to make them work, for lower wages or something like that. What this does, practically speaking, is it extends the life of a bad organization by requiring people to defend it physically or to work for its particular gain. This conscription might be the most intense action that a coercive organization takes, and therefore it must be used sparingly, but you will find lots of threats that are very pervasive and make it so that the organization, so that you're very, very well you're very, very well incentivized to do what they say when they say it, because before you can organize your counterdraft, they will kill you. Another problem with conscription is that conscripted forces, this isn't specifically a problem with conscription, but it is true that if you have conscription, it makes it way easier to fight aggressive wars, right? Which is going to be action number 7, war making. If you have a bunch of slaves that you can throw at your enemies, then you're going to be more likely to make more enemies and to treat them more belligerently than if you actually have to have volunteers that you pay actual wealth, as opposed to just, you get to the front lines, now you get to the front lines, now you get to the front lines. It's, a very different mindset, I guess you could say. Now, as for alternatives to conscription, well, pretty much any voluntary labor agreement would be an alternative to conscription. But let's go through what we got. specifically for defense to start. So to start, we have like mutual defense contracts. These contracts would have to have exit clauses so that they could be enforceable, right? And people would be able to exercise the exit clauses under certain circumstances and paying some particular penalty or whatever. But they would agree voluntarily that if you get attacked, I help you protect you, and if I get attacked, then you help me protect me. These are things that could be arranged to be administered in a fair way without anyone necessarily being forced into it. And if you start out being very good friends with your neighbor and you sign the contract, and then 10 years later, your neighbor becomes a jerk to you for some reason, then you can exit the contract. Another thing that helps a lot is vigorous cultural support of self-defense of person and property. A blade of grass, or a rifle behind every blade of grass, right? The more the people are equipped and ready and, not necessarily trained, but practiced to defend themselves, the less need you have for defensive armies. You still need people to be trained for aggressive armies, because those people need to be trained to follow orders. But a group of people who all, love their neighbors and are in a town where they all kind of are there by agreement, they're going to want, generally speaking, to defend that area from any attackers. Whether they're able to or not is another question, but you don't gain anything additional by being able to enslave people to do that. Liechtenstein could draft every man in its army, but it still wouldn't draft every man into its army, but even that whole population wouldn't be able to fight, the United States Army. Another thing that could be good would be voluntary defense organizations, security, people to man the walls, so to speak, right? You could actually have groups of people who are hired to do that kind of work. And, they get paid a wage in real wealth, and, they know that they're risking their lives, but there are jobs that require you to risk your life. That's just how it goes. Obviously the pay is a little higher because of the increased risk. You can have all kinds of different defense organizations, non-aggression agreements, all kinds of things like that. And all of those have the effect of helping a group of people defend themselves from attacking groups from outside. Now, here's one that is kind of a second-order situation, right? We have trade agreements because, as the old adage goes, where goods cross borders, soldiers usually don't, right? So having trade agreements with your neighbors and saying, oh yeah, we'll help. We'll pay half the money it takes to maintain this road, and we'll make sure that nobody on our side of the half of the road gets waylaid by bandits and yada yada yada. As long as both sides of that organization, both organizations on the sides of that contract agree to it, there's nothing involuntary. You could actually do that with all your neighbors, and now all of a sudden you have these really nice beneficial trade agreements with your neighbors. And so they're very strongly incentivized not to do so. Another thing that is an alternative, but is really kind of more like a passive alternative, is to just let these coercive or poorly maintained organizations fail and collapse, right? Everybody says it's your duty to protect your country. But what if your country's garbage? What if your country has a totalitarian, awful government, and you don't want to protect it? Well, they force you to. They enslave you. Governments, one of the problems with the ability to conscript people is that governments then start to pretend that they are the people. But that organization, which is the government, may not actually deserve defense. Of course, that's something that the people who make up the government have to decide for themselves. Is this thing worth dying for that we call our government? Oftentimes the answer is no, and reasonably so. But it's even worse than that, because when there's not actually enough public support for the government to defend it from an aggressor, which might not actually be an aggressor, right? It might be a liberating army, right? You could have some horrible totalitarian regime that enslaves all of its people, and then someone comes in and says, well, we should, these people are enslaved. We can take out the heads, the slave masters, and we can free the slaves. Well, the slave master will first off make sure that the slaves die fighting before they do. In fact, generally speaking, the government officials are not actually in any kind of danger when they wage war, whether they do so aggressively or defensively. The generals, generally speaking, are not the ones that are getting shot. All right, number 3 is legal positivism. You could call this a couple of different things. You could call it malum prohibitum law or non-tort law or something like that. But I think legal positivism is probably the most expansive version of that phrase. So that's what I decided to call this one. Basically, it is the creation of laws and penalties that go against actions with no victim and no pre-existing agreement not to do something, right? What it does, and this is perhaps we're going to need to make a bit of a logical thought here, but what it eventually does is it confuses morality with legality. And, there's that old adage, I know someone said this, but I can't figure out who said it. They said that if the government started making shoes, that it would be less than a generation before everybody believed that we wouldn't have shoes if not for the government. Well, the government making laws has a very similar effect. If we didn't have the government, there wouldn't be morals. The problem, of course, is that the government can make whatever it wants to be illegal. And there's not necessarily a connection between anything it declares illegal and there being some kind of actual, something aggressive that someone has done towards someone else. You could have a government that decides that Bibles are contraband, right? And then it imprisons anyone who has a Bible. But that wouldn't be a legitimate use of government power unless those people agreed, in some kind of contract that I will not possess any Bibles while I remain under the terms of this contract. This is kind of the basic problem with legal positivism, right? It convinces the people that what the government says is right, and that there's no other, reasonable way to judge anyone's behavior, right? As for, whether it's aggressive or not. Another thing that legal positivism does is it creates the concept of lawful orders, basically justifications for performing permitted murder, kidnapping, or robbery. The law says that X is punishable, even though there's no victim and there's no one claiming that they've been harmed by this particular act, but the law says that you need to put this person in jail and shoot them if they resist. We may pity someone who is indoctrinated into believing that just following orders is an excuse for their actions, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily forgive or absolve them of making right for what damage they've done to someone. Another thing that legal positivism does is it opens the door for regulation of commerce and industry beyond protection from theft, fraud, etc. It creates monopolies. It creates, it creates systems where large organizations can add on to the things that you need to start an organization so that no one can start a competing organization. You create cartels, you create, corporatism, all that kind of stuff. Another thing that this does, that a lot of people probably are going to be in favor of when they first think about it, but then the problems with it in the longer term arise, is that malum prohibitum law, legal positivism is a way for cultures to preserve their own prejudices at others' expense. Now, you might say, well, I want my culture to be preserved, but here's the problem. When you hand over preservation of your culture to a coercive organization like the government, you very easily run the risk that government is going to turn on you and start to promote somebody else's culture because it, gooses GDP numbers or it gets them more votes or something like that. So realistically, people need to re-understand that it is up to them to preserve the good parts of their culture and not for them to use a coercive organization to enforce their culture on other people, because someday that pendulum is probably going to swing the other way. And it's much better if we keep the state out of that type of sphere of action anyway. Another problem is that the weird incentives of legal positivism creates this tangled web of ad hoc solutions. You get this massive class of administrators or lawyers whose job it is to interpret the law. And of course, the law is going to be full with contradictions and little, loopholes and all kinds of stuff like that. This lawyer class effectively is a parasite on the giant body of laws. If all you had And I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but if what you had instead was to, you and someone else both plead your case to a judge that both of you know is a fair person, and that you have agreed contractually to abide by the decision of this judge, and the judge isn't in either of your pocket, right? That's a lot better than a situation where some guy gets to make some weird rhetorical argument based on some kind of strange decision that was made 50 years ago, and that is the thing that's binding because, well, the lawyer and the judge and the other lawyer, they're all on the same team. And the decision going this way is better for them than for you or even necessarily your opponent. It creates this... Then, when you make one law, you create two problems. And so then you make two more laws to create two more problems. And you end up with this, horrible, monstrous pick-up sticks kind of situation where, okay, we'll try pulling out this law. Oh, the results are bad. Okay, we'll put it back in. Well, we'll try pulling this law out. Oh, the results are bad. And then we put it back in. There's not any way to make the situation better other than to remove 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 or 50 laws at the same time, because they've been built up in this way to kind of, support each other. Another problem with kind of this legal positivism is that it tends to lead to a breakdown of the sensibleness of law. You get all these weird rules that you have to obey for no really sensible reason. It's something that somebody said a long time ago and it's just kind of stayed on the books. What this does, actually, is it leads to something much more insidious, which is kind of like a sporadic enforcement of the law. And what this does is it creates exactly the situation that you need to end up with a two-tier justice system, or what has often been called anarcho-tyranny, right? The laws are enforced upon this group, but not upon this group. The laws are enforced upon Group A, but not upon Group B. And when Group B preys upon Group A, it provides Group A with a reason to throw more money at the state, but the state's never going to enforce the law against Group B. So, you end up with this problem where the state just gets bigger and bigger and bigger because nobody realizes that giving it more power isn't actually helping them. Of course, there's a lot of propaganda that goes into that as well. What this ends up doing in the long run is you end up with a breakdown of property rights, you end up with clogged arbitration systems, and all kinds of subsequent problems that arise from this. Not to mention that there's a bunch of wealth going to a class of people that should be doing something more productive than practicing law. What are the alternatives to legal positivism? Well, we have voluntary arbitration agreements, right? You and I could agree that neither of us will possess object X, and there will be a third-party arbitrator who handles that. If we get into a dispute, there will be certain conditions under which we agree to a search of our premises or something like that. You can make these agreements with the belief that it will benefit both of you, and therefore they can be voluntary. You could have voluntary vice prohibition agreements. You could have a walled city, right, where, and the wall could be more or less metaphorical in a sense, right? It could just be a gate that you need to scan your card to get in through, and, something like that, but it could go all the way up to a walled city, right? But the idea would be like 10 warehouse owners get together and they own a big chunk of land, and they agree that, we aren't going to work with cocaine, right? None of us will work with cocaine. And they all agree to it. And they say, yeah, it can be profitable sometimes, but it's really a lot more trouble than it's worth. And so I'll sign on this agreement. We now have this big contiguous chunk of land that all of our warehouses are on, and we ensure that there's none of this particular contraband good on there, and we all believe that we're going to benefit from doing that. But that agreement doesn't apply to people who haven't signed the document, right? Who haven't signed the agreement. So there might be, your employees have to sign, kind of a side agreement to make sure that they won't keep any on the premises. But if you have a setup where people can just walk across this land, for the purposes of just getting from point A to point B, and they're not hurting anyone, but they haven't signed the agreement or, consented to it in any meaningful way, you can't, put them in a cage or shoot them. You have to, you might be able to confiscate the contraband, and you might be able to exile them, but you can't, ruin their lives. In addition, you could even have walled cities with market squares, right? Outside the walls, there's this chunk of land that is, protected, but less protected. and anybody can walk through it, and they're not, they can possess contraband on the market square, but maybe they can't sell it to people who live on the inside, kind of thing. But that would solve a lot of problems without having any of that coerciveness that legal positivism does. Of course, you have to work out things like you have to have some way to have rights of way along or around borders. You have to make sure that nobody gets trapped, effectively kidnapped, because Bob owns a ring of land, and Jim's land is in the middle of the ring, and Jim can't get out. We have to imagine that there should be cases to get around this. One way would be like, hey, if I have land that totally encompasses a chunk of land, then I have to have a sidewalk somewhere that goes across my land. And if you stay on the sidewalk, I can't shoot you for trespassing. Fair enough. But these are things that people can actually agree to and experiment with and come up with a reasonable solution, rather than simply putting the hammer down and telling everybody, do as I say or you will be shot, kidnapped, robbed, etc. Now, of course, the existing system of borders has a lot of problems, right? People didn't agree to them in a lot of cases. They're arbitrary. There's some inbred guy that said, I claim this land for such and such. To mitigate those existing systems, we should try to use systems such as exile and confiscation rather than directly punitive action on people that are holding contraband but not hurting anyone, right? If you just have a Bible, then we can take it and say, yeah, you're gonna have to get a new one, and we can kick you out, but we can't put you in a cage. That's kind of where you reach that border between natural law and legal positivism. Another thing that you would need, of course, is you would need procedural agreements for gathering or vetting evidence. When you enter into an organization that, if you hire a security organization, you need to tell those security officers that, yeah, you will be safe on my land vis-a-vis me defending it from trespassers, right? You have permission to be on my land. If you go to this particular group of judges and they sign a paper with blah, 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 then yes, you can search my premises for some kind of fugitive that might be hiding on my land somewhere, right? People would want these kinds of agreements to some degree. Not to say that they would be exactly as powerful as they are today, but they would exist in a voluntary system to some degree. So that is legal positivism. Let's move on to the next one. All right, number 4 is information control. And this is a big umbrella. This includes everything from media or news control to control of education, science, and engineering, and even includes things like having a moral double standard, right? Saying that when agents of the state do X, it's fine, but when private citizens do X, it's wrong. These are all elements of information control that coercive states use to their own advantage. It teaches people, and the main thrust of this thing, the reason why states do it for the most part, is to teach people that the other ideas or the other actions that the state might take are righteous, even when they damage the people that they're supposedly done for the protection or improvement of. It's like Lenin said, right? The quote, I'm going to butcher the quote, but it's basically, give me the children for a few years and, well, we won't need anything else. Another thing that's commonly used for is to promote or censure various cultural norms. This can have a whole bunch of far-reaching problems. And again, it's better that these things be done voluntarily rather than that they be enforced by some unfeeling organization that is stealing from you. Because if they start doing it, you'll stop doing it, and when they decide that they're going to change directions, you'll be left flat-footed. The incentives for this tend to push toward more and more false information pushed by the government or the state. You end up with bad science or bad engineering funded by stolen money. You get indoctrinated children who've been taught that they have duties to the state. They believe that taxation isn't theft. They believe that conscription isn't slavery, and so on. There's a lot of distraction here for culture warriors, too. Basically, the state puts out some kind of truth and then lets all the culture warriors bicker over it while the state takes their kids and, takes most of their money. We get We also get things like cultural stagnation, or having the culture be pushed in one specific pro-state, usually, direction. Now, the alternatives to information control are pretty simple, because information is something that everybody uses in voluntary and involuntary associations with each other. We can have private, decentralized funding of education, research, journalism, etc. Whenever an organization that can steal money to pay for it, decides to try to control information in any way, you can generally be assured that the long-term effects of that are going to be negative, if not even the short-term effects. We can have another thing that I really want to promote is self-reliance in the defense of your own positive cultural norms. You cannot trust the government to continue to enforce your own positive cultural norms. And people need to be able to make the distinction between positive cultural norms and negative cultural norms so that they can get rid of the bad and bring in more good. People wouldn't be so worried about losing their culture if the culture that they were being given was obviously better. But what government information control does is it kind of freezes things and makes people think about things in a very territorial way, whereas a more individualistic approach would probably be more useful in the long run. It's worth noting that when you rely on the government, while it was helping, it means that you don't know what to do, or you'll be less likely to know what to do when it starts hurting you. And so, again, having your own, cultural norms being protected by yourself and promoted by yourself is better than having the state pretend to be your friend for a while and then suddenly branch off into being very much your enemy. This is kind of what we're seeing in, the UK right now. Item number 5 is prerogative, and we're getting a little esoteric here. Prerogative was actually a chapter in Locke's second treatise, though, so this is actually an important flaw in the classical liberal ideal. So, what prerogative basically is the government doing things that it's not authorized to do because they're good. This, at base level, this ignores trade-offs, which is already a problem. Someone's going to end up paying for this, and if the person that is paying for it doesn't believe they're getting their value for it, they're going to fight back against it eventually. You also end up with things like very vague definitions, like the vague definition of good. Oh, this is good for 99% of the people, but the 1% that it hurt are the ones who are paying for it. That is a recipe for disaster. It is a recipe for, having these little minorities that feel completely subjugated by the state and have no way to deal with that other than to lash out. It's worth noting that if you provide a service, right, you have a subscription service or something like that your subscribers are not bound to pay for your unauthorized good acts, even if they like these acts. You might, it might be that they decide to provide you a reward privately for doing so, but they can and should reserve the right to limit that reward to something that they find reasonable. Think about it this way. If you had an accountant who was working in your house for some reason, and he was walking from one room to another room, and he observed a small house fire, he would be perfectly within his rights to say, you're not paying me for this, I'm out of here, I'll yell fire and I'll run. But, that you're not paying me as a firefighter. There's nothing in our contract that requires me to fight fires for you. So, I'm going to do kind of the what I'm obligated to do just by what doesn't cost me anything, basically. I'm not going to risk my own life to fight this fire. But on the other hand, if what he did was he said, oh, this fire's small enough, I think I can take care of it. And he gets a big blanket and he puts the blanket over the fire and the fire goes out. And he calls out, yells out fire and everybody comes and, they check and everything's good. And he's like, I put out that fire. Now you got to pay me $1 million. Well, it's like, I also am not bound to pay you whatever you arbitrarily agree to or whatever you arbitrarily propose as the payment for it. We can haggle about it, right? You can say $1 million and I can say, get out of my house, right? But on the other hand, what you could do is you could say, okay, I put that fire out. What is your current, you're not obligated to do anything for me, but what is your, if you don't mind, what's your current agreement for fire protection? Oh, you'd say, well, I pay $100 a month plus the cost of, the actual firefighting if I actually need it, right? The $100 a month is low because it because it's basically paying to keep the infrastructure up, and then I pay for the water, I pay for the car, I pay for the fire truck, I pay for the dudes if they happen to come out. It's it prevents me from being lax about having fires if I pay something when they come out for me. And he says, well, how much would that cost? $1,000. Okay, fine. Give me $500. And you might be like, oh, sure, okay, sure, why not? Here's $500. You did a good job. I appreciate it. How's the accountant stuff going? Let me know when that's done. People can make these agreements, but making these obligations causes problems, right? If the accountant was therefore permitted to pull a gun and tell me that I owe him $1 million, more than the price of the house itself, then you're going to create conflicts there. And the idea is to get as many of these conflicts dealt with in a peaceful way as possible. Another thing that prerogative does, government doing good things, is it has a tendency to crowd out charity with coerced giving. Government takes taxes, and then it gives the taxes to somebody that it deems needful. The problem with this, of course, is the problem with any kind of entitlement. The incentive is not to reduce the number of recipients, but the incentive is to increase the number of recipients. Well, we need more tax money because we have more hungry people. In a voluntary system, the amount of charity grows and shrinks with the ability of the people and willingness of the people to pay for it. And different organizations can have different standards for who is deserving of charity. This eliminates people feeling entitled to specific types of charity, which is what typically happens when the government or the state does it. It's worth noting that kind of in the realm of prerogative, that even voluntary contracts are vulnerable to expansive or biased readings by one party. That's why these contracts need to have an arbitrator assigned to them, so that if somebody reads a contract and says, oh yeah, the contract says you owe me this, and you're like, that's not what it says, we have to go to an arbitrator to figure that out. This is, of course, less of a problem for very short-term contracts, right? If the contract is, I give you, an ounce of gold and you give me 4 new tires for my car, there's not a whole lot of opportunity for arbitration there, except if one of us provides fraudulent goods to the other. But as the contract gets longer and longer, the incentives for things to get interpreted, in their own favor gets higher and higher. You get a major problem if the government also interprets that contract in the same way that if I had a contract with somebody and, the person who was the arbitrator for that contract was his brother, I might say, well, hold on a minute, this doesn't sound like a very good deal for me. It's worth noting that when we have organizations that pretend or strive, whether they do so successfully or not, to not be coercive organizations, to be voluntary governments, servants of the people, that because of this, we must only accept the most restrictive readings to any powers that are given to the government. Anything other than that is a path to unlimited power over time, even if it takes 20, 30, 50, 100 years. What are the alternatives here? Well, number one, having some forethought and care when drafting contracts is a big deal, right? You need to actually make sure that, if you're going to sign something, that you actually know what it means. We have to make sure that we try to find and use the narrowest possible interpretations of state contracts and constitutions. The state should have as little power as possible, and any attempt to read more powers into that constitution should be seen as a very real aggression against the people. Other things that help deal with the problems that prerogative is supposedly designed to solve are things like reciprocal and voluntary charity, mercy, and forgiveness as cultural norms, right? If you aren't crowding out charity, then the people are going to be more likely to actually give willingly. And if the people are richer, wealthier overall, which would happen if more things were voluntary and fewer things were parasitic, you would end up with more, top to skim off of. And the skimming would be done voluntarily rather than by force. It's worth noting that in any contract that a person or group might have with the state, a constitution per se, that the clearest, most precise possible language be used whenever it's possible. And whenever someone tries to sneak in vague terms like, general welfare or regulate interstate commerce, that these things need to be identified and ferreted out before anybody signs the contract. Otherwise, what you end up with is a system that is not limited in principle, and it will eventually get not limited in practice. It just might take a while. All right, next up is number 6, and this is the one that I've been harping on at the beginning, about the one that kind of enables all the others. This one is dominion, also sometimes called jurisdiction. What is it? Well, it is the ability of a government or a state to claim kind of a permanent ownership interest in a particular chunk of territory based on someone joining their organization. I call this the most important pillar because it really does enable all the others. Taxation can't really be taxation if you can just exit the contract and take all your property with you. But because you generally aren't allowed to do that, or are only allowed to do that under very, very, very stringent circumstances, you kind of are forced to pay the tax, or else, be jailed and or died. Here's the thing. Contracts need exit clauses in order to be enforceable. In order for you to enforce a contract with someone else, you have to say, and this is what you have to pay if you don't do the, put in what is required of the contract. And these things can range from very easy to very, very strict. And a lot of the time, people are very used to not having exit clauses in contracts because their contracts are made under the jurisdiction of a state, right? And so the exit clause is actually implied by the system under which the contract is created. But contracts that detail such a system, one that would be a framework under which other contracts would exist, need to have an exit clause, otherwise there's no way to enforce it. So any social contract that doesn't have an exit clause is really just a slave contract. You give us whatever we say you give us, and, you can't leave, you can't go away. And this is what makes the system actually specifically coercive. Now, if you're entering a protection contract of some sort, as I mentioned before, you generally do give up some property rights to do that. You agree to allow agents on your property under certain conditions. You agree to submit to investigations if they're handled under the proper protocols. You agree not to obstruct investigations that are also handled under proper protocols. You pledge to use the arbitration option for certain crimes, right? You might agree that nobody here, you and a bunch of people might agree that nobody can just shoot a thief in the back. And there are reasons why you might do that. For instance, mistaken identity, or the inability to prove that someone, or the ease of pretending that someone stole something by just putting some goods near their body after you shoot them, right? And so you say, well, if I see someone doing this, I'm going to get information. They're going to start an investigation, and in good faith, they're going to try to get my stuff back for me, plus restitution. In fact, all these questions that need to be determined by different societies need to also be tried with different methods. That's kind of what civilization is about. It's about saying, well, how does this group do this thing? How do they accomplish this particular end? Are they doing it peaceably? Are they doing it coercively? Are they doing it aggressively? Are they doing it whatever, right? Different groups need to be able to try different methods so that culture and civilization can advance. If you just put everything in stone by people being under these states that they don't have any power to do anything with, then you really kind of end up in a situation where stuff stagnates. Another thing that dominion does is it makes it very difficult to distinguish between 3 different types of stances toward the state, right? I'm going to call them, for the sake of argument, consent, complaint, and dissent, right? So you might consent to a streaming subscription, right? You might pay for Netflix, right? And, if you just do that and you don't ever complain and you're just like, yeah, I like Netflix, they're pretty good, then you're consenting to that thing as long as you continue paying them, as long as they decide to keep providing the service. Now, let's say they decide to raise their prices. Some group of people are like, well, inflation, yada, 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 it's probably fine. There will be also a group that says, oh man, I wish they didn't increase their prices, and they would be maybe very vocal about it. But they still would continue to pay the fee. This is what I call the complainer class. And In a voluntary society, we can very easily tell the difference between complainers and dissenters. The dissenters are the ones who cancel their subscriptions. If you are in a system that has dominion, where the state has jurisdiction and you can't get rid of it, then you can't really tell the difference between a complainer and a dissenter. You might say, oh, well, you still pay your taxes, but the penalties for doing so are quite large, and it's very hard for a person to decide that they're going to go to that extent, even if they are actually dissenting to the state organization. Another thing that dominion makes difficult is it makes it hard for there to be out valves for dissent to go. So if everybody's trapped in this territory, then they can get very, very angry about what the state is doing. And in fact, even though you say, oh, this was done through the proper procedures or yada yada, they might say, well, that procedure was never designed to work for this particular type of action that's being taken. And the fact is, and this is one of the things that is right at the end of Locke's second treatise, is that it's not you who gets to determine whether somebody else decides they're at war with you and the state that you're supporting, right? It's them. And so the point is that we have to have ways for people who believe that the state, whether they're right or wrong, right? These people who believe that the state is shafting them need to be given some kind of way out. And if you have strict dominion, then they have no way out. And the only way to deal with that is with, something like violence. Things like theft and slavery and kidnapping, etc., all can be reasonably perceived as violence, regardless of the justification that the thief, slaver, kidnapper, whatever, puts in front of it. So, you can't really say, oh yeah, Bob says it's okay for me to steal from you. That a person doesn't need to accept that argument. And in fact, what you can do if you get rid of dominion, if you allow secession, is that you can cut out this required connection, and people who really don't like what you're doing can leave peacefully, and you just say, yeah, go in peace, and I'll go in peace, and we'll see if maybe there's something we can do together later. It's worth noting that dominion or jurisdiction creates an incentive structure that prevents the government from improving. In fact, it promotes the government not improving. If people can secede, then bad governments will lose territory until they vanish. If good governments exist, then they would then in a reasonable voluntary system, they would gain territory, but they wouldn't enforce it too strongly, and as long as they don't enforce it too strongly, they're still incentivized to keep doing good work in order to incentivize other people to join their voluntary organization. When you make the whole thing involuntary, you end up with problems where you have this big government that maybe was good a long time ago, but now it's doing really, really bad stuff, and nobody can do anything to stop it because, they're all required to continue to pay taxes. And the costs of leaving include all of their wealth or possibly more, if they're allowed at all. Another thing that dominion does is, over time, it kind of creates this sense of ownership or entitlement among state agents themselves. Nowhere else is, ending a subscription to a service seen as some kind of unforgivable violence. If you cancel your Netflix subscription, they don't boycott, they don't picket your house, right? But a government, if you tell a government or a state that you don't want to be part of their state anymore, they will send people to shoot you. And the reason that they do it is because they see your leaving as some kind of violence against them. Or at least that's the way they spin it. But in fact, it's not that. It's just, I don't approve of your actions and I don't want to fund your organization anymore. There's nothing wrong with saying that, but the longer that these borders stay kind of static, the more the government agents feel that they are entitled to that territory, and that gives them a lot of really bad ideas about what they can do to people who want to leave. Another thing worth noting is that if the borders of an organization that we call a government changed frequently, the people would be used to it, including the government agents, and they wouldn't feel this kind of like, oh, we need to take revenge on this guy for leaving our blessed organization that we call the state. Another thing that getting rid of dominion does is it helps to prevent there being these subjugated minorities that can't do anything but are just parasitized by the government and the larger groups in the state. This is one of the cases where the state might be doing something that a small group decides is so morally reprehensible that they don't want to be a part of it, right? And if those people were allowed to leave, then there would be no problem. They would say, well, yeah, they're doing morally reprehensible stuff over here, but we're not a part of that anymore. We're not paying for it. So what are the alternatives that we have to dominion? Well, the obvious one is to allow secession and to make it relatively affordable. Secession down kind of to the individual household level. Mises talked about this. He said that if this were possible, if this were viable, then it should be done. And Rothbard just took the extra step and said it should be done because there's going to be chaos, but that chaos is only there because it hasn't been allowed for so long. Basically, you have to be able to secede with land. You can't. The state doesn't own your land. If the state owns your land, then it has stolen it. And in fact, handing over these rights and gaining services, this trade that you did to join the government, necessarily is less than the full value of the land. And so if there is some kind of money that has to, or wealth that has to change hands to do secession, it should be considerably less than the market value of the land that is trying to secede. The state also has to get away from the idea that it can directly retaliate against anyone that happens to want to leave its organization. And of course, that's one of those things that gets built up, as I mentioned, the longer that these borders are kept constant. There's this sense of entitlement that the state agents develop within themselves. And it's a very natural process that something hasn't changed for a long time. Suddenly this guy wants to change it. Well, he must be an enemy. If you don't have that long-term staticness, then there's less of a reason for people to get really, really angry about it. If it happens 10 times a day in both directions, then, it's just something that happens every day. Again, like I said, this might be chaotic at first, but the reason it's chaotic is not because secession per se causes chaos. It's because people joined an organization thinking that it was going to do good for them, and gradually over time, those people have, the number of people who believe that the government is actually doing bad for them has grown and grown and grown, and they've had nowhere to go. So, yes, there would probably be, if the U.S. government suddenly said, yes, you can secede with land tomorrow, there'd probably be a bunch of people who left all of a sudden. And then over time, a lot of them would probably come back when they realize that the difficulties of being your own, sovereign nation are a little bit more significant than they thought. And it would also create incentives for the U.S. government to do better as opposed to doing worse and worse and worse, which seems to be the path that we're on right now. So Dominion is this important because it enables all the other ones, right? If you can leave, then they can't draft you. If you can leave, then you can't really complain that your taxes are being taken against your will. If you can leave, then you don't have to listen to their state propaganda organs. If you can leave, then their particular set of vices that they want to enforce against don't affect you, or only affect you if you decide to keep being part of that organization. So, dominion is important because it is such a crucial element to enabling all these other things we're talking about, including the next one, which I put at the end for a specific reason. Here we go with number 7. That will be war making. War making. I left this one for last for a couple of specific reasons. Number 1, because it inevitably depends upon all these other pillars. You need tax money. You need soldiers. You need people to believe that it is in their interest to attack these innocent people in another land. You need the government to act as if it's a slighted noble who will slap another country's person with its glove, kind of thing. You need dominion because you need territory to fight over. Another reason that I left this for last is that it's specifically something that states do to outsiders rather than subjects. In general, there are cases where that line is blurred, but generally speaking, war is between a state and another group of people, whether that be a state or some other private organization. What war is it really is kind of like all the bad stuff that states do to their own people combined and then directed against probably innocent people in another area. It is not the case that that there can be no just wars. Rothbard had a writing about, libertarian just war theory, which I think is worth taking a look at. But, generally speaking, states don't act that way. They act like they get offended. An organization cannot be offended, but states often do act as if they've been offended and use that as a casus belli to shoot a bunch of innocent people who didn't actually have anything to do with the offense. And the people who are offended are very often not the ones that go do the fighting against other people who are not the ones who did the offense in the first place. It's a very horrible way to take and destroy the wealth of a free people, or semi-free people, right? And make things worse for them while pretending that what you're doing is, putting up resistance against some kind of affront that was done to other, by people from another country. The heads of state are always kept safe and insulated from the direct effects of their desire for war. What are the alternatives to war? Well, voluntary cooperation or voluntary even competition would be great. But like self-defense, possibly organized, as I mentioned before. The group of people, a rifle behind every blade of grass is a great defense against invasion, and a great defense against, even attempts to hold control over land rather than necessarily, march over it. It's worth remembering that there's no right to collateral damage. Governments often do this thing where they each commit collateral damage on each other, and then they agree that neither of them is going to try to prosecute the others for that collateral damage as if it were a war crime, which, of course it is. Any kind of violent action, whether it be in self-defense or or not, it needs to be targeted, not general. You can't bring in innocents into the war in order to shoot innocents and not shoot the guys who actually have guns. Yeah, it's easier to shoot the innocents, but that's not really the way that things ought to go. A just war is defensive in nature by requirement, right? You can't claim I want your wealth, and that's a good reason for me to march in and shoot you. And so, the alternative would be to get rid of these offensive wars and, focus on defensive nature and defensive maneuvers instead. And, when these kinds of conflicts happen, there would be some kind of reasonable restitution if possible, but again, these are all things that would need to actually be decided voluntarily by groups of people who are not, shooting at each other, basically. At some point, these two organizations are going to come to some kind of an arbitrator, whether that be a court or whether it be a diplomat from a third-party country, and agree on terms. The aggressor should certainly pay some kind of restitution, but again, it needs to be something that they actually agree to, and it's actually maybe, supported by evidence. Those are those 7 types of action that I think are pretty good at kind of anything that a state does falls under one or more of these actions, right? That is, any coercive actions fall under one or more of these 7 types of action. And so I think that it's very important to note that these are actually all elements of like a Lockean society. Information control, less so, but it's pretty easy to go from the government should support education to the government should do education to government education should just be indoctrination in favor of the state. It's one of those things where you could get there from what Locke describes in the second treatise on government, and the other 6 are all things that he believes governments ought to do. And so, I'm hoping that by talking about what makes them coercive rather than voluntary, and by also mentioning that there are potential alternatives that might be useful, that we better understand what the flaws in any government that is supposedly created under a classical liberal servant of the people kind of commission, and observe the problems that it has in its structure so that we can better deal with those problems going forward. So, the best solution would be to get rid of these 7 things in all statecraft, and if the state is doing any of these things, then, hey, the state is what's the word? The state is coercive and not voluntary. It's no longer serving the people by definition. That's a little too much to ask for average people. But from a kind of an anarchist, voluntarist perspective, I thought it would be worth at least making these classifications and talking about why, what they are and why dominion, which often gets short shrift. Like, people don't talk about dominion a lot. And I think that that's a mistake, because it is a really big, important thing. Again, if you can leave the government with your land, with your wealth, then you're a complainer about taxation, but not necessarily a dissenter. If you can leave, there's no justification for you to commit violence on state agents as people who are stealing, enslaving, kidnapping, etc. From you. You can just leave, and so you actually have a non-violent outspout that you can use to get away from an organization that you think is being a parasite. So yeah, that's kind of where I wanted to go. Not just criticism, but actually looking at these things and actually making some real classifications and kind of moving things in a voluntary kind of direction. I hope you may have found some of this useful, but that's what I've got for this week, and I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that you had some thoughts about this. If you can think of any other kind of action that doesn't fit into any of these 7 slots, I'd be curious to hear what you think, because I think I got most of the coercive acts of government. And we need to separate coercive acts of government from acts that government does that maybe are like funded coercively, but they would also exist in a free market, right? Like, the government monopolizes scientists, say, but there would be scientists in a free market. So, like, the taxation to fund the scientists is bad. The information control that the scientists do as government agents is bad, but, like, just having scientists, is not part of the badness per se. And just try to break these things up into reasonable chunks so that we can, like, identify things. So yeah, anyway, that's what I've got. Hope you enjoyed this. As always, appreciate you for watching and listening. This is a long one, so thanks for sticking around. If you like the channel, if you like what I'm doing, you know what to do. And I will see you next time with something. I don't know. I'm going to try to do maybe some short, funny videos in the next week or so. So we'll see how that goes. Anyway, talk to you later. Have a good weekend, and I will see you next time.